Okay, so let me begin with this little presentation I put together. And again, what I'm trying to focus on is the issues, the challenges, and the opportunities of what can be done in the management of cybersecurity. I say technology, but I guess it's also any kind of mitigation action. Could be procedures as well. And what I want to do, the agenda, the issues I want to cover. First, I'll give you just a little, like everybody, I'm not going to tell you about all the incidents that happened last year, but I just want to define what I'm talking about when I talk about what is an ICS system, what are the threats, and then I contrast that with some survey data I have as to what companies are really worried about. The one side is saying, what should they be worried about? The other thing is saying, what are they worried about? Then I want to talk about how they're managing the cyber risks. And we have a little model we put together for the kinds of things companies can do. I have a little thing, it's kind of a start of a maturity model that we're developing at ARC. But then I'm going to contrast that with what companies are actually doing, all right? And the result of that, at least when I was preparing it, is you'll see there's a gap between what people say they should be doing based upon what they're afraid of, but with what they're actually doing. And my question is really, why is there a gap? What can we do to get rid of the gap, and some issues like that. So with that said, here's just a very high level thing with an ICS system. You know, on the left side, you'll see the traditional kind of engineering Purdue model. That's what I've always called it. A Purdue model, a picture of a control system. You see PLCs and HMIs and workstations and all that. But from a cybersecurity perspective, just think of it as what's on the right. You know, you have something in that gray area is, let's call that the plant or the unit or whatever is the region that we're talking about, the boundary for that facility. Facility, again, it could be a facility within a facility. And within that you have people, networks, oh, I have a picture here, I'm sorry. People, networks, and endpoint devices. And all of those are subject to attacks. And my terminology is anything outside the boundary I call an external attack. Anything inside the boundary I call an internal attack. And internal is not the same as insider. That's a different issue. An insider could end up doing an attack from the outside. It's got to do with physical location, okay? And the kinds of threats that people have to worry about, I think this is a pretty standard kind of breakdown of it. You know, there's hackers who are just people who are just out trying to disrupt stuff. Hacktivists who have an intent. They're a little more targeted things. Cyber criminals, terrorists, and nation states. Those first 4 or 5 are common. And then at the bottom I have insiders, okay? Now again, insiders is not necessarily someone inside the plant, it's someone with certain privileges that treats them as an inside person, so they don't have to, they can get through defenses. And if somebody loses those credentials, somebody else could use it to become an insider. Each of these kind of attackers has a different type of goal. And then more importantly, I think it's got to do with capabilities, at least the way I see it. Let me show you a little picture I did to try to talk about the capabilities. This is something just with respect to likelihood and impact of an attack. If you look on the left, that's likelihood. The green line is likelihood of an attack. And certainly we're far more likely to get incidents or get attacks from hackers, just malware going through the internet, than we are from an unfriendly nation. I'm sure there's some plants that are worried about unfriendly nations, but we're certainly much more likely to get attacked by hackers. And then the next might be hacktivists, then cyber criminals, then terrorists, then unfriendly nations. And let me mention this. If you look, I put in the capabilities of these actors. And so don't get hung up on the names I give them, because I'm really talking about the capabilities. On the left are non-targeted attacks. They're just somebody creates a malware that gets passed all over the place. And the people who do that are pretty savvy with IT. They might be young kids, but they could be serious criminals too. But they have certain IT skills. As you go over, and I have it under cyber criminals again, but in the middle, is now you shift from that to targeted attacks. Now you have somebody that's actually after you. It's not just accidental, they're after you. And it's very IT savvy people. So they can get into defenses. They can get by defenses that you have. They know about vulnerabilities. They have 0 days and things like that. To the far right is targeted attacks, but it's people who also have expertise in ICS, in control systems. They understand how control systems work. They know what they have to do to disable things. They know what they might have to do to get around a safety system, to change things like that, kind of the Stuxnet case, okay? Very sophisticated, very, very sophisticated. Now, if you look, the green line there is the likelihood that you'd get attacked by one of those, and it certainly goes down. The more sophisticated the capabilities, the more targeted they're going to be, the less likely it takes a lot of time to attack you for a nation state. Where the red line is the impact that might happen. You know, and you've probably all seen this kind of a picture. You know, the impact's much worse. The potential impact's enormous over on the right. On the left, it's more of a nuisance. It's not that you want to ignore that, but it's more of a nuisance, okay? Now, if you think of what you have to do to, you know, for those, we were talking about risk management in the last session. And, you know, risk management's a likelihood and an impact kind of combination. Cybersecurity, people talk about a threat actor, a vulnerability, and an impact. But, you know, threat actor and vulnerability kind of go together to say what's the likelihood you'll get attacked. So I just talk in terms of likelihoods and impacts. And the risk that one gets from a certain likelihood and impact, sometimes people will just multiply the two. That's what you do like in financial accounting with expected values and stuff. But it's at least a product of the two. It might not be a mathematical product, but it's a combination of those two factors. What's the likelihood something will happen, and what's the potential impact that it'll have? And if you look at this, in order to protect yourself, on the left side there, if you just look at the chart, the thing you have to reduce is the likelihood. You're trying to keep those things from getting in. You get over on the right side, now what you have to focus on is reducing the impact. Now, the two aren't necessarily, first of all, the two things are quite different. What you do to reduce impact and what you do to reduce likelihood are quite different. And I'm not saying that if you're on the right, you would only try to reduce the impact. You kind of have to do the likelihood and the impact, okay? Now, so that's the issue, is to reduce likelihood and impact. And I did a survey recently. You all may have seen it. Some of you may have participated in it. I haven't yet closed it, though I should have closed it, but I haven't yet. So if you still want to take it, I'd be happy to have you take it. You get a free copy of the results. But what I did, one of the questions I asked the end users in this case was, what are you most concerned about? And I use those categories: general hackers, hacktivists, cyber criminals, terrorists, and unfriendly nations. And I defined it, if I remember correctly. And if you look and see what they're concerned about, they're concerned about general hackers, probably because of this nuisance thing. You know, people just don't have time to keep trying to get malware out of systems because somebody went to some website they shouldn't have gone to or something like that. But the ones that have the most concern are in the middle there: cyber criminals, terrorists. Most people are not that concerned about unfriendly nations. You know, you have to be in a very specific region and have a very specific reason why you're worried about that, though I think we should be a little more concerned about that personally, but anyhow, so that's what they're concerned about. So one thing that I think is, in order to, if you're going to build a cybersecurity strategy, you need to have a strategy that covers all the ways up to the thing you're worried about. All right? Now I'll use this idea in a moment, okay? So this is saying you need to have a cybersecurity strategy that takes care of reducing the likelihood in the best way you can, as well as reducing the impact to some extent, okay? Addressing both issues. Notice on the top, by the way, I put insider threats. Again, insider and internal are two different terms I'm using. Insider is someone that has privileges that either they lose or they exploit, they do something malicious. And an insider, the threat from an insider, it all depends on what their role is in the company, what their skills are. You know, I could think certain things, you know, if you have an insider who's an operator and he intentionally tries to damage stuff, he can probably damage stuff to a point, okay? So I just want to make the point that's where I have insiders. Now, so that's the kinds of threats, the threat actors and the things we have to do. Now, the kinds of attacks you have to worry about. You know, I've done a lot of analysis for custom projects and things. And you know, you could go crazy picking out all the possible vulnerabilities and things, matches that you could get, combinations. But when you break it down, what I found, and I think I saw it, I don't know if it was on Keith's, it might have been on your slide. I don't know if it was on yours, or if it was on Eric's. But anyhow, it's the same three categories. You know, somebody can misuse privileges. Either they do it themselves or they lose them somehow, like through spear phishing or something, but privileges are misused. Now somebody has access into the system and they misuse it. And that gives them a lot of freedom. Or somebody could attack a network. And generally it's for some protocol or some network where you don't have security, which is very common in industrial networks, like Modbus or something like that. And then the bottom one is malware intrusions, which is what we talk about all the time. Everybody talks about the malware intrusions. And each of those types of the ways of attacking could come from internal or could come from external, okay? And actually, most attacks will be some kind of combination of that. You know, it's very incremental. It's a stepwise thing. Now, whenever we talk, so if that's the attacks, if these are the things you have to protect against, what can you do to protect about? And this is what I mentioned, we have like a little maturity model. And again, I don't think there's anything brilliant about the steps, but I just like to structure things a certain way. And if I were to tell somebody like the last question in the last session, what would you do? You know, you can look at it and say, first thing you should do is secure the devices you have. My heavens, if, you know, why wouldn't you block your USB ports? Why wouldn't you harden the system? Just do that. You don't have to buy anything. You just have to do that, all right? If you can, all right? So the first thing is securing. I call it secure, just simply securing what you have. It's like locking your door in your house. But no, it's probably more like closing the door in your house. You close the door. You're an idiot if you walk out of your house and leave your door open, all right? At least if you close it, you're at least doing something to secure it. Better if you lock it. But anyhow, the kind of things, cybersecurity things, are physical security, security practices, device hardening. Also, I think most would have some kind of access control, a reasonable password kind of system, and a patch management program in place, because what you're doing is just trying to make sure this thing is secure. All right, so that's kind of the first level, and this goes across. You know, the maturity of the program would go up. I would say, the level of security goes up, the program maturity goes up. The second stage is once you can have things secured, then you should worry about defending them. That's when you worry about blocking things that are trying to attack the thing that you've already secured. And in that case, you're talking about architecture changes like DMZs or maybe firewalls, unidirectional gateways, as well as anti-malware. The purpose for all of those is to stop something that's coming in, okay? We all have to still understand we're still going to have things that get by, those kind of ways of stopping. And in that case, you want to make sure that if something does get in, it at least doesn't propagate. And this is kind of the IEC 62443. One of the key things was the zoning and structuring and firewalls. And a big reason for that is you're trying to contain the infection. If something gets in, you want to make sure it doesn't go all through the place and propagate. And in that, I see that be zone firewalls, device firewalls. I also put application whitelisting in there because I see that as a containment strategy, because the intrusion is in. There's a question of what do you call an intrusion, a successful intrusion. I call it if it actually gets in your system. If it can't execute, you've stopped it after it was an intrusion, okay? So you're controlling, that's that transfer over onto reducing impact. And then the next thing is you have some intrusion in your system that you have to deal with. So there's an issue of managing. And managing, you use things like SIMs, maybe technology like breach detection, you have an incident management program, and so on. And then the final thing that I'm seeing a lot, or seeing more of these days, is things like threat intelligence. You see it particularly a lot in the IT cybersecurity world, more than in the ICS, I think. Now, when you look at that, and I'm going to reference at the bottom where I say reduce likelihood, reduce impact, because they kind of go that way, just so happen. I don't know if I structured it that way or if it just happened to fall that way. But based on that, one other thing is, obviously, this is kind of given, but obviously as you get further out and you go in your program maturity or you increase the level of protection, the costs are going to go up. That's that exponential curve going up. And one of the reasons, it goes up for two reasons. One is you've got to buy solutions, obviously. You have all the licenses you have to keep paying. But the other thing is the resources you need and what you have to actually dedicate to managing that technology. You know, on the left, you can get by, if you're just hardening devices, you get a team, you go in, you harden the devices, you do something, and it's done. As you have to start maintaining things like profiles and firewalls, application whitelists, and do things like that, you start to need more people. So maybe you can get by with a part-time someone in your plant. The more you go to the right, you're going to start needing a full-time ICS staff, or staff of people, whatever kind they are. Excuse me. And then far to the right, what I'm seeing is very major corporations. Like if you're really into threat intelligence and trying to anticipate attacks and things like that, most companies, the terms I hear them using is, you know, a cyber operations group. And I would call it an ICS cyber operations group. That's what you're going to need, and that's what raises the cost a lot. Now, if you look at what we said was required, this is a different scale than what I was using before, but if you take just that bottom where it says reduce likelihood, reduce impact, that's about, see that black line there? That's about what's required, okay, I think. And in order to stop a threat from, if you use those headings that I had in the early studies, to stop a terrorist, a sophisticated attack on you, again, I'm using those words just kind of as classification, but an attack by somebody that's very skillful that could get in and really damage your plant, you need to at least have something like intrusion, you know, SIMs and breach detection, and you need to really monitor your stuff, all right? That's what you need to do that. Now the question is, what are people actually doing today? So back to my survey. I think of, yeah, here's some data I got in my survey. I don't have all the questions here or anything, but one of the questions I've asked, and this is this, I did this survey last year, and the results are kind of similar. That'll change a little bit, but they're pretty similar in general. But if you remember those steps I had, defend, contain, manage, they were the three middle steps. Those technologies, if you see, what the scale is on the left is the percent of people who say they use that technology today. So if you look at the blue one on the top, that's a blue line that says defend, where defend points to it, that's antivirus, anti-malware software. Everybody uses that in one way or another. If you come down here to the contain, like if you look at the green line there, that's like host-based firewalls. Down below it is application whitelisting. There's also host intrusion protection, though I don't, that one I think is an anomaly, but host intrusion detection certainly and things like that. And then at the very bottom is the ones more with SIMs and things like analytics, all right? So what my point is just, the higher up it is the more likely it's being used, and the ones that are being used are obviously coming from the left to the right in my other chart, which shouldn't surprise anybody. Hopefully you do the easy stuff first. Though I'm not sure that happens. Because when I talk to companies, they'll immediately say, oh, I'm going to buy all this stuff. And then they don't know what to do with it. All right? So they don't get the basics down. That's another thing about my little maturity model, my point at least. Unless you do the previous step, you're just wasting your time because you aren't going to get the benefit of the next step, in essence. So it's kind of a sequence in that. If you look at firewalls, that was another one of my questions on the survey. And this is the same kind of chart where it's the percent that are using them. And I was surprised, actually. I think it's a little higher than that. But this is just around next generation firewalls. It's very common today to use next generation. You probably hardly can't buy anything that's a next generation firewall. But if you look at the features they're using on the firewall, a lot of companies are using the basic features. Very few are getting more granular. It's got to do with how granular. And one of the reasons I think that's true, that's one of my arguments here, and one of the things I want to discuss with the panel, is I don't think they can maintain the rules. They get very complicated, things change, and that's the feedback I get from companies. So that's the state of the technology. That's from a technology side. So if this is where it's required, and those were technologies that are on that list, on the chart, if the required is where it is, here's where we are. And so my point is, I think there's a gap there. Now when I say a gap, there's a gap between what those companies are actively saying we need, without consciously saying what controls we need, what they need to invest in. But the security they want and the security they're actually going to get based on what they've invested in. So then the question is, why do we have this gap? Okay? And I looked at a couple things here. I don't want to, I'll go on forever here, which I don't want to do. But to me, there's people, you know, in my business, everything's people, processes, and technology, always. So if you look at a people perspective, I looked at it from three perspectives in my survey, and I didn't do the survey for this presentation. I did the survey for another thing, so I'm kind of adapting information I had there that I think is related. But here's a case where I asked a question, who in your organization is responsible for a variety of cybersecurity, like in a program, like all the way from policy development and governance to auditing, technology selection, compliance reporting, a whole list of activities, processes or activities, I guess you could call it, within a cybersecurity program. Who's responsible? The blue is a central group, mostly a central group is blue. Red is an equal responsibility between central and plant-centric in the plants. And the right is mostly local. I use the word local instead of plants, okay? And not surprisingly, you know, at the top you have a lot of central control. It shifts then now to equal responsibility. But you get down to the bottom, my concern is all the green that's there, particularly when you get down to technology implementation, configuration and patch management and all that. Those people are stuck with that work, whether they want it or not. Another way to look at this is I asked the question from the point of view of the control system components. And at the top, I don't think I organized it this way intentionally. I organized it by which one had the highest number on the blue bar there. But it actually kind of went the same as a Purdue model down from the top. At the top you have interfaces to enterprise IT solutions, interfaces to engineering solutions, supervisory control and manufacturing IT. Those are the top three. And then you get down to the real heart of an ICS system, control system servers, control system PCs, embedded control systems, and at the very bottom you have DCS and PLC and so on. And the color on this one is, on the left, the blue is mostly IT is responsible for it. The red is shared responsibility. The green is mostly the ICS group, okay? So again, people, and actually I should qualify. What I asked them, I was saying, based on your experience, who do you recommend should do this, all right? And I'm presuming that a lot of times it's what they do, okay? But even if they're not doing it, that's what they say is the best way to do it. So there's a real push to have the ICS people do the maintenance of the cybersecurity technology. And this one was, so one of the things I've done in my market studies, I do market study every year on cybersecurity, and one of the things that I've seen trends, and I believe is very true, is the highest growth part of that market is in cybersecurity services. So one of my questions here was, how much do you use services today? And actually this question, it was one where I asked how much are you using today, how much will you use in 3 years, and stuff like that. It's a very complex question. But this is the current time. And at the top, you'll see people gladly bring in cybersecurity service groups to do system vulnerability assessments and things like that. But when it gets down to managing patches and doing things like that, again, most of them say we keep it ourselves in-house, which I don't know if that's necessary or not. I know there's different perspectives on that, certainly. But anyhow, I think that's true. Then the other thing was just the technology, and that I'm saying I see what they're doing, and I think there's gaps. And if you look there, this is the technology. This was a question. One thing I always get when I ask this question is most companies say we have enough technology. We have sophisticated enough technology to do what we have to do. What we need is some software or tools to help me manage the software that I have, the technology I have. And that came out, that was the same way last year, it came out that way this year and things like that. Though the ones on the bottom, I think I had other questions that aren't showing up here because the only two showing up here are things like multi-factor authorization and mobile device security. But usually it's got other things like advanced analytics and stuff like that. They're saying that's nice, but I don't need that. At least they don't think they need it. So that's my presentation as to what I think is the problem, or a problem, personally, and I want the panel's view of that. And the kind of questions I'm hoping to ask the panel. Well, let me frame the questions, but I would really love if the audience asked the questions more than me. I might start with one. But, first of all, is there a gap? This gap that I say that's there, is there really a gap in most companies? If there is, is there a gap in that sense? And also meaning, are people not using advanced technologies or not able to take advantage of technologies? And if so, why not? Some people might say they don't need it. Other people might say we can't manage it. And so I'm kind of interested in that aspect. And this issue of cybersecurity expertise, I'm just curious myself now if that still remains a major, major problem. The last market study I did, I had the growth of the services market, and I had to clamp it because of the lack of people with cybersecurity expertise. And we had that discussion in the workshops. I'm not sure that some of these certifications that people are getting, I think they might be good to maintain technology. I don't think it's going to deal with incident management and stuff like that, trying to get rid of an infection and stuff like that. And so I'm curious about the services side. So with that said, now I can go and sit down.